Here is a question I need you to sit with for just a second. What do you do when the same water that destroys your life also saves it? Hold that thought because by the time I'm done talking, you'll never look at a cup of coffee or a flooded basement the same way again. Welcome back to Dad's True Revenge. Grab your snacks, get comfortable, and remember the people in these stories have every chance to behave themselves. They just chose wrong. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. You're going to love it here. My name is Matthew Callaway, and 14 months ago I had everything. Not everything. I wasn't the guy with the yacht and the vacation house in Aspen, but I had a factory, Callaway Precision Parts, sitting on 4 acres just outside Millbrook, Ohio. 43 employees who called me by my first name. A wife named Diane used to pack 2 sandwiches for my lunch because she said I always forgot to eat when I was excited about a new contract. And I was always excited about new contracts. Then the flood came. Not a slow creeping flood. Not the kind where you have 3 days of news coverage and time to move the furniture upstairs. I'm talking about a Tuesday morning in March. The sky ripped open. And by noon, Callaway Precision Parts was sitting under 6 feet of brown water. 6 feet. My CNC machines are gone. My inventory gone. The filing cabinets with 12 years of contracts and client records floating somewhere near the parking lot like sad metal boats watching it all. And I said the only thing a man can say in that moment, well, that's that. My foreman, a big quiet guy named Dennis, stood next to me. He looked at me sideways and went, "You good, boss?" And I said, "Dennis, I haven't been good since 2019, but I appreciate the question." He didn't laugh. Nobody left for a long time after that. The insurance company was the first betrayal. Not the last, but definitely the warm-up act. I filed the claim within 48 hours. I had documentation, photos, 12 years of meticulous records, because Diane always said I was obsessive about paperwork. She meant it as a complaint. Turned out to be the only compliment that ever mattered. The adjuster, a pale, thin man named Gerald, who looked like he'd never rained on in his life, came out, walked around, typed things into a tablet, and told me with the energy of someone reading a grocery list, "Mr. PlayStation Everest. Callaway, the preliminary assessment suggests the flood event may fall under the Act of God exclusion clause in your policy. We'll need to conduct a full review." I stared at him. "Gerald," I said slowly, "are you telling me that God specifically targeted my factory?" He blinked. "I'm saying the natural disaster classification. Because if God came all the way down to Millbrook, Ohio to flood my building specifically, I feel like I deserve a reason, a note, something." Gerald did not find that funny. Gerald put me on a review list that apparently had no end. Diane left on a Thursday. Not during the flood, not in the immediate chaos when I might have understood it. She left 4 months after when I was deep in the middle of fighting the insurance company, sleeping 4 hours a night and surviving on gas station sandwiches. A board presentation, and said, "Matthew, I've been doing a lot of thinking." And I said, "About what?" And she said, "About us, about where this is going, about whether I can keep doing this. Being married? That should have told me everything. A woman who doesn't flinch when you say something like that has already made up her mind and is just waiting for you to catch up. I'm not built for survival mode," she said. "I need stability. I need—" "You need stability?" I repeated. "I just lost 12 years of work in one morning and you need stability. Don't make me the villain here." I looked at her for a long moment. This woman who'd packed 2 sandwiches because I forgot to eat. Just noting the timing. 1 suitcase. A box of things she had already packed, which told me the decision was not, in fact, new. She kissed me on the cheek like I was a distant relative at a funeral, and walked out to a car that was already waiting at the curb. I stood at the window and watched her go. Then I went and made coffee, because what else do you do? The motel was called the Sunrise Inn, which was either deeply ironic or deeply optimistic, depending on the day. Room 114. Single bed, a TV with 3 channels that worked, and one that was just static, which I watched sometimes because it felt honest. I settled into a routine the way a drowning man settles into water. Slowly, then completely. Every morning, I caught the 7:15 bus downtown to meet with lawyers, adjusters, contractors, and various human beings whose job was to tell me why I couldn't have my life back yet. Every evening, I caught the 6:40 bus back. The driver on the evening route was a man named Roy. Roy Cooper. Big hands. A face like a map of somewhere that had seen the weather. Mid-50s maybe. The kind of man who looked like he'd been sitting in that driver's seat since the bus was invented. He never said much. Neither did I. But somewhere around week 3, I started bringing him a coffee from the cart outside the downtown station. Just black coffee, nothing fancy. The first time I handed it up to him, he looked at it, then at me, then at the road and said, "What's this for?" And I said, "You get me home every night. Seems like the least I can do." He nodded once. Took the cup. That was our entire relationship for 11 months. A cup of coffee, a node. Occasionally, if the traffic was bad, Roy would glance in the mirror and say something like, "Construction on 5th again." And I would say, "Naturally." And that would be the entire conversation. It was the best relationship I had. Now, here's the part where I need you to lean in because I've been setting the scene. I've given you the flood, the factory, the wife, the motel, the routine, but none of that. None of it is the actual story. The actual story started on a Wednesday night in February when Roy drove right past me to stop. I looked up from my phone, Millbrook and 6th. My stop gone, disappearing out the back window like everything else in my life. "Roy," I called out. "You missed my stop." He didn't answer. I looked around. The bus was empty. Just me. I hadn't even noticed everyone else getting off. I stood up and walked toward the front, and that's when I heard the pneumatic hiss of every door locking at once. I stopped walking. Roy's eyes found me in the rearview mirror, and they were different from every other night. Not the steady, quiet eyes of a man watching traffic. These were the eyes of someone who had been waiting. He said, "And I will hear these words for the rest of my life." He said, "Sit down, Matthew. There are 2 men in the alley behind 5th and Crane right now, and there's a woman who's about to pay them $100,000. What woman?" He looked at me in the mirror for one long second. "Your wife." I sat down. The bus rolled on through the dark, and Roy said the 2 words that turned everything I thought I knew about the worst year of my life completely upside down. He said, "Watch this. If you've made it this far, do us one quick favor. Subscribe. A lot of people watch without ever doing it, but it costs you nothing and means everything to us. Thank you sincerely. Let me tell you something about silence. There are different kinds. There's the comfortable silence, the kind you share with someone you trust, where nothing needs to be said because everything has already been. There's the awkward silence, the kind at dinner parties when someone says something slightly offensive and everyone suddenly finds their food fascinating. And then there's the silence that sits inside a moving bus at night between a man who just heard his wife's name and a bus driver with secrets behind his eyes. That last one, that one has weight. I was sitting 4 rows back, gripping the metal bar of the seat in front of me like it owed me money. My brain was doing that thing it does when information arrives faster than it can be processed. Just spinning, finding no traction, producing nothing useful. I kept thinking, $100,000, 2 men, your wife. I leaned forward and said, trying to keep my voice level, failing completely, "Roy, what is happening right now? Who are those men?" His big hands rested on the wheel like we were just having an ordinary Wednesday. "Private investigators," he said. "Good ones, ex-military. They've been sitting on that alley for 3 hours. Why? Which means the first 2 had already happened. Which meant while I was in room 114 of the Sunrise Inn watching static television and eating gas station sandwiches and thinking my biggest problem was a flood and a heartless insurance adjuster named Gerald, my wife had been wiring money to people I'd never met. "Roy," I said slowly, "how long have you known about this?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, long enough. He pulled the bus over on a dark stretch of Meridian Avenue, put it in park, and reached under his seat. He pulled out a phone, not his regular phone, a second one, older, a prepaid thing, and he held it up so I could see it in the mirror. "I'm going to call her now," he said. "I need you to be quiet, completely quiet. Can you do that?" I almost laughed. Almost. You're asking the man whose entire life just got flipped upside down if he can sit quietly while you call his estranged wife on a mystery phone. "Yes." "Yeah," I said. "Yeah, I can do that." He dialed. I included the rings. 1, 2, 3. I actually found myself hoping she wouldn't pick up, which is a strange thing to hope for, but I wasn't exactly operating at full rational capacity. She picked up on the 4th ring and her voice. I hadn't heard her voice in 4 months. It hit me somewhere I wasn't prepared for. She sounded exactly the same. Calm, composed, slightly impatient the way she always answered calls from numbers she didn't recognize. She said, "Hello." Roy's voice changed. Not dramatically, just slightly flatter, like he'd set something down. He said, "The drop location has been compromised. You need to pull your men out of the alley." Dead silence. 3 full seconds of it. And then this is the part I need you to really hear. Instead of saying, "What alley?" Instead of saying, "Who is this?" Instead of saying any of the 1,000 things an innocent person would say, Diane said, How compromised? Roy caught my eyes in the mirror just for a second. His expression didn't change, but his eyes said, "You heard that, right? You heard exactly what that means." I heard it. How compromised? Note, I don't know what you're talking about. Not, you have the wrong number. She dove straight into operational damage control, like a woman who had been managing something complicated for a very long time. Roy said, "Compromised enough that you should be concerned." She said, "Is this Henley?" "No, shorter this time." When she came back, her voice had dropped half an octave, and something careful had crept into it. "Then who is this?" "Someone who knows about the levy, Diane." The silence after that one was so long and so heavy that for a moment I truly wondered if she'd hung up. I looked at the phone screen in Roy's hand. Still connected. Still counting seconds. Then she said very quietly, "What do you want?" I realized I was gripping that seat bar so hard my knuckles had gone white. I loosened my fingers one by one, like I was physically dismantling something. "The levy?" I said. My voice came out strange. Hollow. "What does the levy have to do with anything?" Roy put the bus back in drive. "Everything," he said. "It has to do with everything." He talked while he drove slowly. The way a man talks when he's been holding something for a long time and is finally carefully setting it down. His name wasn't just Roy Cooper, the bus driver. 8 years ago, Roy Cooper was Roy Cooper, the civil engineer, a senior consultant contracted by Millbrook County to assess the drainage infrastructure along the Sycamore River Basin. His job was to identify vulnerabilities, flag risks, write reports. He wrote one report in particular, a report that identified a specific section of the flood barrier on the eastern edge of the industrial district as critically undermaintained, a section that under sufficient rainfall conditions would fail. "I filed that report in 2019, he said. Submitted it to the county board, sent copies to 3 separate oversight offices. What happened to it? It was reviewed, he said, by a subcommittee and then quietly buried by a city engineer named Frank Baldwin, who decided that the repairs were too expensive and the risk was too low to justify the budget line." I stared at the back of his head. "Roy," I said, "that's the part that failed." "That's exactly the section that flooded your factory," he said. Yes, I couldn't speak for a moment. The bus moved through the dark streets, and I just sat there trying to locate the floor beneath me because it felt like it kept moving. "That's not all," he said. Of course it wasn't. Roy had lost his career over that report. When the flood happened and people started asking questions, Frank Baldwin needed someone to absorb the blame. Roy's report, the one that was supposed to prove he'd done his job, was quietly altered in the county records. Dates changed, recommendations softened. By the time anyone looked, the document said Roy had assessed the barrier as adequate with minor monitoring. He was let go quietly with a small settlement and a non-disclosure agreement he'd signed before he fully understood what he was signing. "So, you became a bus driver," I said. "I became a bus driver," he said. "And I started watching because I knew what happened. Wasn't an accident. I just couldn't prove who had decided it was a good idea to let it happen." "And you found out 3 months ago," he said. "Yes." He paused, turned the bus onto a street I didn't recognize. "The flood wasn't just negligence, Matthew. Someone knew the barrier was going to fail, and someone made financial arrangements before it did. Someone who stood to benefit from the destruction of the industrial properties on the east side." I felt something cold settle at the base of my spine. "What kind of financial arrangements?" Roy reached into the side pocket of his driver's door and produced a folded envelope. He held it back toward me without turning around. I leaned forward and took it. Inside were printed documents, financial records, a property portfolio I didn't recognize until I got to the 3rd page and saw a signature I'd been looking at for 11 years. Diane Callaway, dated 14 months before the flood. She had purchased options on 3 parcels of land on the east side of the industrial district. Land that would be worth almost nothing if the factories on it were operational, and worth a fortune for commercial redevelopment once they were gone. My factory sits in the middle of all 3 parcels. I folded the papers back into the envelope with the care of a man handling something that might explode. "She knew," I said. The words felt strange in my mouth, too simple for what they meant. She knew the flood was coming. She invested around it, around me. Roy nodded once. "The 2 sandwiches?" I said stupidly, irrelevantly. "She always packed 2 sandwiches because I forgot to eat." "She packed 2 sandwiches," I said again. And I don't know why I kept coming back to that except that it was the thing my brain had chosen to represent everything I'd believed about my marriage. And it turned out even the sandwiches were a performance. Roy said gently for a man who'd just detonated my entire understanding of the last 14 months. "I'm sorry, Matthew." I looked out the window. "The men in the alley," I said after a moment. "The investigators? They're yours. Yes. You've been building a case. Yes. And you needed. I stopped, turned it over. You need someone with personal standing, someone who can be a witness, someone with motive to see it through, who couldn't be paid off or pressured into dropping it. In the mirror, I could see the faintest nod. That's why you drove past me stopped. That's why I drove past you stopped. Hands. Then I looked at the back of Roy's head. What happened next? Roy said, next, he made a mistake. And when she does, he glanced at me in the mirror one last time. We make sure the whole world is watching. The idea of emotional expression was a firm handshake, and the phrase could be worse. I stubbed my toe once at age 9, started to tear up, and he looked at me over his newspaper and said, walk it off, Matthew. The toe is still there. So when I told you that sitting on that bus holding that envelope, staring at my wife's signature on documents that proved she had financially engineered the destruction of everything I'd spent 12 years building, when I told you I felt something crack open behind my eyes, I needed you to understand that it wasn't a weakness. It was the specific surgical pain of a man realizing that the person he trusted most in the world had been for a very long time the most dangerous person in his life. Roy parked the bus. Not at all. A depot. Not at a stop. He pulled into a lot behind a closed hardware store on Clement Street, cut the engine, and turned around in his seat to face me for the first time all night. The lines around his eyes ran deep flood, my factory has been made cash payments to people in alleys, and that you, the man I've been bringing coffee to for 11 months, are actually a disgraced civil engineer running a private investigation from a city bus. He nodded slowly. So, I said, to answer your question, no, I am spectacularly not okay, but I'm listening. Keep going. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but close. He laid it out clean. The two men in the alley, their names were Garrett and Phil, both former Army investigators, both currently licensed private investigators in the state of Ohio. Roy had hired them 6 months ago, burning through most of what remained of his settlement money. For 6 months, they had been documenting Diane's movements, the payments, the meetings, the paper trail that connected her land investments to Frank Baldwin, the city engineer who buried Roy's report, and then altered it to cover his tracks. Because here was the part that made everything worse, and I genuinely did not think it could get worse. But life is creative that way. Frank Baldwin hadn't buried that report on his own initiative. Someone had asked him to. Someone had approached him 18 months before the flood with a very specific request. Let the barrier fail. Delay the repairs. When the water comes, and it will come, the report says, so make sure the paperwork reflects that everything was adequate, that nothing could have been predicted. In exchange, Frank Baldwin received a very generous anonymous deposit into an account his wife didn't know about. The person who made that request, I think you already know. She approached Baldwin directly? I asked. Through an intermediary, Roy said. A property lawyer named Curtis Webb. Very careful man. Very expensive. But Garrett found a payment from Diane's secondary account, an account you didn't know about, to Webb's firm dated 16 months before the flood. I pinched the bridge of my nose. A secondary account. She opened it in 2018 inches her maiden name. I sat with that. Diane Mercer. That's what the account would have said. Diane Mercer, who became Diane Callaway, who packed 2 sandwiches, who sat across from me at our refinished kitchen table and said, I'm not built for survival mode, who had apparently been in planning mode for years. Roy, I said, why did he need the factory gone specifically? The land deal? She could have just bought property anywhere. Roy folded his hands. Because Callaway Precision Parts had a right-of-way covenant on the central parcel. As long as your factory was operational, she couldn't consolidate the 3 parcels for commercial redevelopment. The covenant was buried in the original deed from 1987 and tied to active industrial use of the property. I stared at him. So, she didn't just need the flood, I said slowly. She needed my factory. Specifically, she needed me destroyed. Yes. She married me knowing we don't know exactly when she identified the covenant, Roy said carefully. But the account opened in 2018. 4 years into your marriage. 4 years in. Which meant there were 4 years that might have been real. Or maybe that was just the thing a man tells himself to keep from completely coming apart in the back of a parked bus. Could be worse, Matthew. The toe's still there. Thanks, Dad. Not helpful right now. My phone buzzed. I looked down. Unknown number. I explored at Roy. He said, answer it. I answered. Silence for a moment, then a voice I didn't recognize. Male, low, unhurried. Mr. Callaway, my name is Curtis Webb. Every hair on my arm stood up. I looked at Roy with wide eyes and mouthed, "Webb," and he straightened immediately, reaching for the prepaid phone. Webb continued, "I think we should have a conversation before things go further than they need to," I said, keeping my voice remarkably steady for a man whose entire nervous system was screaming, "How did you get this number?" "Your wife gave it to me," he said, "about 10 minutes ago." So, she'd made a call after Roy hung up on her. Of course she had, because Diane didn't panic. Diane managed. That was the thing about her. She was the most composed person I'd ever met. And I used to think that was a quality. And now I understand it was a survival mechanism belonging to a woman who'd been running a long game for years. "She's worried," Webb said. "And when my clients are worried, I make calls." "What does she want?" "She wants to know what it would take," he said, "for tonight to go away." I looked at Roy. Roy was already typing on the prepaid phone. A message to Garrett and Phil, I assume, because within 30 seconds, my own phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number that contained just 4 words. "Keep him on recording." I put the phone back to my ear. "That's an interesting question. What does he think it would take?" Webb said. "She's prepared to be generous with the money she made betting against my factory." A pause. "Mr. Callaway, I'm just clarifying the source of the generosity. Curtis, I want us both to be clear about where the money comes from." Another pause. Longer. When he came back, something had shifted slightly in his tone. The professional smoothness was still there, but underneath it was just barely. Something that might have been discomfort. "She wants to offer you a settlement," he said. "Significant. Enough to rebuild." "Enough to what?" I said. "Enough to make me forget that she sat across from me at her kitchen table while I was sleeping 4 hours a night and eating terrible sandwiches alone, by the way, because she wasn't built for survival mode?" Silence. "She built the flood, Curtis," I said. My voice was very quiet now. The quieter I got, the more I could feel something solid forming beneath me. Something that hadn't been there since March. "She built it and she stood in it with me and she watched me drown. And then she walked out to a car that was already waiting. You tell me what number makes that okay?" Webb said nothing for a long moment. "Then, and I will remember this forever," he said very quietly, away from the phone, as if he'd half forgotten I was there. "Diane, I don't think this is going to work." And I heard her voice in the background. Sharp, controlled, 2 words. "Make it work." Roy held up the prepaid phone so I could see the screen. A text from Garrett. "She's in a car on Clement. Black Audi. 50 yards from your position." She followed the bus. I looked out the window of the dark bus into the parking lot. There was a black Audi idling at the far end. Headlights off. She was right there. For a strange suspended moment, I thought about everything that car represented. The car that had been waiting the night she left. The car that had been, I now understood, always waiting. Idling quietly at the edge of my life while I worked and built and trusted and had absolutely no idea. I said into the phone, "Tell her to come talk to me herself." Webb said, "That's not tell her," I said. "That her husband is sitting in a bus 50 yards away, and if he has an offer to make it, he can look me in the eye when he makes it." I heard him relay it. Long pause. The Audi's door opened. She looked exactly the same. That was the thing that got me. Some part of me had expected her to look different, to look like what she was. But she walked across that parking lot in a dark coat, hair pulled back, chin level, and she looked exactly like the woman who had refinished a kitchen table with me on a Saturday afternoon and laughed when we got stains on the dog. She onto the bus, stopped when she saw Roy. Something moved across her face. Recognition, recalculation, fear, all of it in about half a second. And then the composition slammed back down like a shutter. She looked at me. I said, "Hi, Diane." She said, "Matthew." A pause. "I see you've been busy." "I've been riding the bus," I said. "Turns out that's where the interesting people are." She looked at Roy. "You have no idea what you've gotten involved in," she said to him. Roy said with the absolute serenity of a man holding 4 aces, "I've been involved since before the flood, Mrs. Callaway. Longer than you." She turned back to me. And for just a moment, just one, the composition slipped. Not much. A hairline fracture. But I saw it, and I think she knew I saw it. And I think that was the moment she understood that the version of Matthew Callaway she had calculated for, accounted for, and dismissed was not the version sitting across from her right now. "What do you want?" she asked. I reached into my jacket and set the envelope on the seat beside me. Didn't hand it to her. "Just let her see it." "Frank Balden," I said. "Curtis Webb, every account, every payment, every conversation, all of it. You give Roy's investigators full cooperation. You provide documented testimony, and you make sure the man who altered that engineering report faces what he did." She stared at the envelope. And if I don't? Then Garrett and Phil walk out of that alley with 3 months of documented evidence, the financial records from your account in your maiden name, and a very detailed conversation between you and Roy that's been recorded since you picked up that phone tonight. I paused. Gerald from the insurance company is going to find the whole thing very interesting. So is the county DA. Silence outside. Somewhere in the dark, the Sycamore River was moving quietly through the city, the way it always existed, indifferent and unhurried, not caring at all what it had washed away or what it had in the end made possible. Diane looked at me for a long time. Then she sat down. The full cooperation agreement was signed 11 days later. Frank Baldwin was accused on 4 counts, including criminal negligence and falsification of public records. Curtis Webb surrendered his license and cooperated with prosecutors in exchange for reduced charges. The county opened a full review of flood barrier maintenance across the entire Sycamore Basin. Roy Cooper's original report was officially entered into the public record, with the correct date, the correct amendments, and his name on it unaltered. He cried when they told him. He didn't think I saw. I saw. As for me, the insurance settlement came through, the full amount. Funny how quickly Gerald moved when the words criminal conspiracy and county liability entered the conversation. Callaway Precision Parts broke ground on the new facility 8 months later. 43 employees came back. 3 new ones joined them. I still ride the bus sometimes. Not because I have to. Room 114 is a long way behind me now. But there are Tuesday evenings when I catch the 640 just to sit in the back, watch the city scroll past, and remember what it felt like to be a man with nothing left right before everything changed. Roy retired in the spring. The county gave him a formal apology, which he accepted with one nod and no speech. On his last night driving, I brought him a coffee from the cart outside the downtown station. He took it, looked at me. He said, "You know, you don't have to do that anymore." And I said, "Roy, you got me home when I had nowhere else to go. I'll be bringing you coffee until one of us isn't around to drink it." He was quiet for a moment. Then, for the first and only time in the entire 2 years I'd known him, Roy Cooper smiled. A real one. The full thing. He said, "Buckle up, Matthew." And he drove. There's a thing my father used to say. Could be worse. The toe is still there. He wasn't wrong. But here's what he never told me. Sometimes the flood doesn't come to destroy you. Sometimes it comes to showing you exactly who was standing next to you and who was holding the water back. Know the difference. And always, always buy the bus driver a coffee. If you like this story, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more real, raw, and family-centered stories. And as always, thank you for being a part of this sphere.